Not shocking, because over the last year, President Trump has been engaged in a dizzying campaign to increase violence in this country. He is restoring gun rights to felons and people who have lost their ability to buy guns. He eliminated the White House Office of Gun Violence Protection, and he has stopped funding mental health grants and community anti-gun violence grants that Republicans and Democrats supported in that 2022 bill. So he has been engaged in a pretty deliberate campaign to try to make violence more likely in this country. And I think you're unfortunately going to see the results of that on the streets of America.
Well, and, they're exactly the people that you don't want. And, of course, it's the immigrant communities and the minority communities, as we saw when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, who are helped most by cleaning up crime. But let's move on to, speaking of the president here, who is, of course, Zohran Mamdani's either BFF or public enemy number one, depending on the day. He is going on his own warpath here, this time not just talking about Venezuela, which we talked about earlier in the program, but he's also pushing now against the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, as part of his campaign against drug trafficking. Kelly Jane Torrance, tell us more about the broader war against imported drugs from South America that Trump is taking on. It's not just about Venezuela. He's now opening up potentially a whole front with South America. How is this being received in New York and more broadly across the U.S.?
Well, I think most Americans are really worried about the drugs that are on our streets. Until recently, overdose deaths from drugs were up every year. Only recently it started to stabilize and even go down a tiny bit. And so most Americans are very worried about this, and they don't want drugs coming in from other countries. Now, of course, you do have liberals who, anything President Trump does, they hate. So they're, finding reasons not to like this. And of course, they don't like that he's been attacking narco terrorists as they try to come into the United States with their drugs. And so Colombia, a reporter asked him about the Colombian president, Petro, and Trump has, he often likes to think out loud, and he's saying, well, I haven't got any plans yet. But, as he started talking, he kind of felt like he was talking himself into it. Yeah, that guy's going to be next. Let's do him next. And so, I think it's an interesting threat. And certainly Colombia is, for decades and decades has been one of the biggest importers of drugs into America, and even, drugs that are coming from other countries like Mexico they originate a lot of times in Colombia. So it's a huge problem. And certainly, one that no president really recently has tried to do anything about. President Biden certainly had no policy to try to stem the flow of illegal drugs, and certainly Barack Obama didn't. So, Trump really is one of the first presidents recently, and he's tackling it in a very different way. This is not, the war on drugs that I think is a little bit hopeless because, attacking people here in America, possession and that sort of thing is not really going to work. But he's really going after the source of the problem, which is really, I think, a great way to tackle it. And certainly acting like who knows who could be next. Again, Trump playing the kind of wild man, that unpredictability, that does worry some of these guys because they don't know what he's going to do. Who knows? They could be next.